Turns out very many Ethiopians today carry Portuguese blood, and of course, that adds to the complexity of the history of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a very complex history. Now, this is from the book I'm reading at the moment, and it's a book that was published in 1902, but the text in the book come from much earlier. The text from the book, and the title of the book is the Portuguese Expedition to Abyssinia. And now, while the book was published in 1902, the text that is in the book comes from the 16th century. And most of the text was written by two individuals, one Bermudez, João Bermudez, who was a priest. And for the most part, he was, we could say, embedded in the Abyssinian royal family. He stayed, especially during the time when Abyssinia then was fighting with the Adal Sultanate in the 16th century. The other individual who contributes to the text in the book is one Castahoso. Now, Castahoso was a Portuguese soldier who fought alongside the son of Vasco da Gama, Cristavio. And he was in the group that was trying to help the Abyssinians overcome the Adal Sultanate, which had basically conquered the country, the entire country. Now, and they managed to do that in 1543 when the Imam of Adal Sultanate, Ahmed Gurey, was killed at battle. Now, the Portuguese started coming to Abyssinia much earlier, and that's what is described in this book, especially in the introduction that is written by the person who put together the book, and that is one R.S. Whiteway. Whiteway gives us a very long introduction where he tells us about the interaction between Abyssinia and Portugal, and we could say mostly Portugal in this book. And it tells us about especially the rumors that were in Europe about an existence of a Christian, we could say, state that was surrounded by non-Christians. And initially, the Europeans were looking for it in Asia, then they came to Africa, and the Portuguese were actively looking for that state. And at some point, they came to conclude that it was actually Abyssinia, and they started sending diplomats trying to engage the Abyssinians. The Abyssinians were also sending out embassies to Europe, to Portugal, to the Vatican, and much of the rest of Europe. Now, that happened before the conflict between Adal and Abyssinia became very intensive in the 16th century. Now, when that conflict became very intensive, and Ahmed Gurey basically conquered the entire of Abyssinia, the Portuguese, and this time they have a colony in India, sent a team, and the team was led by two of Vasco da Gama's sons. The one who stands out the most, of course, is Cristavao. And Cristavao is the one, after reaching Massawa, or Massawa, I think it's Massawa, which is Eritrea today, he left with a team of Portuguese, and they went to Abyssinia, and then they engaged Ahmed Gurey. And initially, they sustained a lot of, we could say, destruction. And eventually, actually, Christopher is killed at a battle. And not really at a battle, but he's injured and then he's captured and taken to Ahmed Gurey, who kills him. And then, of course, the remaining soldiers are very bitter about that, and they organize themselves. They do a counter during a battle, and they end up killing Ahmed Gurey. And with that happening, the rest of the Adal army basically decided to leave Abyssinia. Now, R.S. Whiteway goes into detail to tell us what happened to the remaining Portuguese soldiers. He tells us, of course, there were a sizable number that lost their lives, but there are also a significant number that actually survived. And he explains, and he got this information, the way he puts it, he got this information from different sources, especially from the Portuguese who left and also who stayed and later on left, because there are those who almost immediately at the end of the war they left, but those are very few and the most senior ones they left. And then there are those who stayed behind a little bit and left it later on, like Bermudez, because he had been appointed to be a leader of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to some extent. Of course, his mission was to make the Ethiopian Orthodox Church become part of the larger Holy See Church, the Catholic Church. It wasn't successful, and in fact, that became an issue after the end of the war with the Adal Sultanate, where Bermudez and other Portuguese who remained behind were trying to push Abyssinia towards that direction. And the ruling emperor then after the war was Claudius. And Claudius was not interested. And after Claudius dies at another battle with Adal Sultanate, his brother takes over Minas. Minas is also not very interested, and the Portuguese really fights Minas because of that. They don't succeed, but it never happens that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church ever became part of the Catholic organization. Now, I'm going to read a part of this book where he tells us about the remaining population of the Portuguese soldiers becoming part of the Ethiopian society. And he also mentions in a note about, could be in the 19th century, where a queen could be a wife of a reigning emperor. I don't know whether it's Menelik or could be somebody who reigned before him, who mentioned that she proudly carried the blood of the Portuguese, or the blood of the Portuguese was flowing in our veins. Now, let's read this part of that book and see what R.S. Whiteway says about the people who remained behind. And actually, it gives us the numbers. He breaks down the numbers, which I found to be very interesting. And he talks about doing a lot of research on this. Seems like he did some research or a lot of research on this topic. This is what he writes. The special task of the Portuguese in Abyssinia was now ended, but their country had abandoned them to their fate, and the Indian government was unable, even if it had been willing, to send ships to the sea, to the Red Sea, to bring them back without a display of force that would have severely taxed its resources, which is very interesting. These people left India. They were actually Portuguese, but they came from India when they went to Abyssinia. And seems like they were expected to go back to India. But the Portuguese didn't have the resources to bring them back home. So they just left them in Abyssinia. He continues, Castahoso came away in a chance vessel in 1544, but its commander, Diego de Reynoso, got into serious difficulty with authorities in consequence of his conduct in the Red Sea, where he was guilty of various piratical acts. So he says that Castahoso, who contributes to this book, just got lucky and got a ride through a ship that had the captain had a lot of issues, seems like. He continues, Correa tells us of 5 other Portuguese who escaped. He does not say how in 1550. Now, Correa is another person. There's not so much text from him that it's included in this, but that text is included in this book actually. He continues, Bermudez got a vessel to take him back in 1556. Now, Bermudez was the priest. 1556 is like more than 10 years after the war. And there were probably a few others, such as those of whom Cauto speaks, who returned while the Constantine de Braganca was viceroy. 1558-61. But the main body remained in the country. The main body of the Portuguese remained in Abyssinia, married Abyssinian women, and were by degrees merged in the population. So they married local women and they basically became part of that society. From the date of the death of Imam Muhammad, the Ethiopian chronicles, which never say much of the Portuguese and their exploits, lest a reflection should be cast on the Abyssinians' glories, only mention them intermittently. So it looks like in the writings of the Ethiopian historians, they kind of like try to avoid mentioning the Portuguese for, of course, for image reasons. Of course, as patriots, they were interested in portraying Abyssinia as a powerful commonwealth, of course, monarchy or empire. And so it didn't look good to say that there are people who came from outside to try to help us stabilize and recapture our country. So they basically kind of like ignored them or did not mention them a lot. He continues, they give us, however, to understand that they had numerous disputes about religious matters with the representatives of the Abyssinian church, thus confirming the statements of Bermudez. Now, while the local historians often avoided talking about the Portuguese soldiers who were left behind, because, of course, of image issues. They mentioned them when it came to the issues of conflict about religion. And I've talked about this in another video where I discussed the reign of miners. And miners had a lot of problems with the Portuguese who were left behind. The Portuguese ganged up with, I think, somebody called, I think is Isaac, who was a prince from the northern side, and they were trying to remove him from power. And they fought two large battles. One of them, miners won, the other one he lost. So it seems like these Portuguese are mentioned in that historical context, but not in other matters. He continues, Kauto in his decades could be a document he wrote, and the letters from the missionaries in Abyssinia somewhat fill up the gap. Altogether, 170 Portuguese escaped from the battle in Wafla, namely 120 with the queen, that is the queen, the wife of the emperor who died in 1540, and the mother of Claudius and the mother of Minos, and 50 with Manuel da Cunha or Cunha. Of these, apparently, 93 was still living in Abyssinia in 1555. That is 13 years after the battle. But there were, if Bermudez is correct, other Portuguese there also. So beside the number of 93 of the soldiers, there were other Portuguese, so the number could be a little bit higher than that 93. So we could say over 100. His story is that while he was in Debra, and he appears to have been there from 1554 till he left the country, there came to Abyssinia from Egypt a Venetian who he calls Maisa Yonka to arrange for the ransom of 50 Portuguese prisoners in the hands of the Turks, that Galadeos or Claudius duly ransomed them, and that they were brought to Abyssinia. So besides the over 90 Portuguese and others, there were also those that Abyssinia ransomed from the Turks, and they were brought to Abyssinia and they were settled in Abyssinia. This story may possibly be true, for we know from other sources that several Portuguese were captured by the Turks in Pir Beg's attempt to drive them out of the Persian Gulf in 1552. When Fort of Muscat and several vessels were captured. There is a tradition mentioned by Salt that the Gujarat province was peopled by the descendants of the Portuguese, and that these descendants were noted for their physique and their fidelity. If this be true, it is contrary to the general experience regarding crossbreeds. Now, that last line is very interesting for a reason, and it is interesting because during this time, we are talking 16th century, the initial texts were written. But then we are talking of 1900s, early 1900s, when this book was published. And seems like R.S. Whiteway had some opinions about what happens with people who are born of different races or who have parents from different races. And actually, in this introduction, there is a part where he talks about an individual who was given to be a commander, I think, in the Portuguese army, and he was half European and half could be uh, Ethiopian, Abyssinian. And he says there were concerns about his ability simply because of his mixed parentage. And so he says those people who were thought to have been descendants of the Portuguese and the Ethiopian or Abyssinian women were seen or came to have the reputation of having very beautiful physique or things like that, and their fidelity. And so he says that kind of like disapproves the understanding then that people who are born of parents from different races maybe would have some shortcomings. I think that's what he's trying to say here. I don't know whether these are his own opinions, but I will not be surprised because R.S. Whitway this book is written or published in 1902. That's when he wrote the introduction that we are reading. So it won't surprise me that that's what he thought then, because very many British actually and Europeans in general in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, actually believed that people who have parents from different races would have some shortcomings. It's not like today. It's not really a big deal. But again, now more and more people are coming to understand that there is nothing like pure anything when it comes to humans. People are all mixed up, have always been. There is no gene pool that is has been isolated from the other. It's never. Let nobody lie to you. All people are mixed of something, which in the end then begs the question: what does mix even mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's just human. Anyways, so that's what he writes in that introduction. But of course, the interesting part of the part I've read is that there was this huge population of Portuguese. Many of them came to fight on the side of Abyssinia in the war with Adal, and then they were left behind. Portugal could not take them back home, and then there were others who were captured by the Turks. Portugal could not take care of its people. It had to be that Abyssinia had to intervene and ransom them, and after that, bring them back to Abyssinia and basically give them citizenship. This is a very interesting part of history. Now, you might think if we are going to say maybe uh, give maybe about 200 Portuguese got to settle in Abyssinia in the 16th century. That might seem like a very small number, but it's not. In the years that have come after that, there's a possibility a very huge population of Abyssinians today have some amount of Portuguese blood. Some maybe they know, some maybe they don't really know about that. And looks can be very deceiving. You might think they have to look a certain way. Not really, not really. After generations, there is a way that people come to look. I did a video about this individual who it's thought came from Abyssinia or could be Central Africa and went to Russia and went into the royal court and later on married a Russian woman and they had kids and then they got into royalty. And then I was doing research that some of the British royal family have the blood of this individual. And you can Google that and it's available. You can read that. And the descendants look very white, like the white of the white, but they acknowledge that their ancestor was black from Africa. So looks can be deceiving anyway. So yeah, so there is a population of Abyssinians or Ethiopians today, because those also can be two different concepts, who carry the blood of the Portuguese, and it must be a very sizable population actually. Now, you can get this book on Amazon. Check the description box of the video, check the pinned comment. If you are watching on TikTok, check the profile bio, and if you are watching on Facebook, there is a link attached, and you can go have a look at the book. Those are my random thoughts.